Today, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce here as part of the Meditation Summit, Joseph Goldstein. Joseph has been leading insight and loving-kindness meditation retreats worldwide since 1974. He's a co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society, the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, and the Forest Refuge. His books include One Dharma, The Experience of Insight, and Mindfulness, a Practical Guide to Awakening. Joseph, welcome to the Meditation Summit.
Thank you, Tammy. It's a pleasure to be here.
The subtitle of your book on mindfulness is A Practical Guide to Awakening. And to begin, can you share with us the relationship you see between mindfulness meditation and awakening? Awakening is often something I think that is quite mysterious and confusing to people, and I'd love to know what you mean by it.
Well, the practice and the teachings of mindfulness come from one quite well-known discourse of the Buddha called the Satipatthana Sutta, or the Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness. And he opens this discourse with a very bold statement. He says the practice of these four foundations, or we could say four arenas of mindfulness, is the direct path to liberation, is the direct path to awakening. And he then proceeds in really just a few short pages to lay out a template for practice, pointing to the different areas we can investigate within ourselves, within our own mind and body, with very specific instructions of how to go about it. And so in that sense, it's a practical guide. The Buddha is laying out in a very systematic way a path of practice that leads to awakening. And so then we might say, well, what exactly is awakening? And people describe, you could say awakening or enlightenment, in many different ways. And sometimes it gets quite metaphysical, and abstract. The description of awakening that feels to me the most pragmatic and the most down to earth, and the one that we can most easily relate to, is the mind freed from or purified of greed and hatred and delusion. And that really is what mindfulness practice is about. That's the end that it serves. Through just an increased ability to be aware, to be mindful, to be investigating the nature of our experience, we begin to see for ourselves what is skillful in our mind, what's wholesome, what leads to happiness, and what doesn't. And we begin to see that it's really the forces of greed and desire and grasping, or hatred, aversion, fear, or delusion, simply not knowing what's going on, that these are the root causes of suffering, not only for ourselves, but suffering for others and suffering in the world. When we look around the world today and just see so many examples of people in difficult situations, suffering situations, many times we can trace the causes back to systemic or society or individual acting out the force of greed and the force of aversion. How much of the injustice in our society is because of people's fear or because of their greed or desire. And of course, in the practice, in the meditation, we begin to see all of this at work in ourselves. And that's kind of the beauty of the explorations, the beauty of mindfulness. When I first went to India, this goes back to 1967, I went looking for a teacher and I traveled around going to various places. I ended up in Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha was enlightened, where I met my first teacher, Anagarika Munindra. And he said something that was so simple and so straightforward that I knew I was in the right place. He said that if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. That was it. There was nothing to join. There was no big ritual, no ceremonies. It was just this very simple, really instruction or path. If you want to understand your mind, observe it. And then the practice that he taught, which is the practice of mindfulness, was the methodology for doing that. So this is the path of practice that we're on, the path leading to awakening, to freedom.
Now, Joseph, you described awakening as a mind free of greed, hatred, and delusion. And I'm imagining someone who is new to hearing this description, and their response might be something like, well, I know when there's greed in my mind. I can feel that. I can feel that sense of, more for me, more for me. Hatred, I definitely know when that's there. But delusion, well, that's a slippery one. I think I'm deluded so much of the time. How would I be able to observe how and when I'm deluded?
Yeah, it's actually very simple, and we can experience it many, many times in a day. So, just for example, in meditation, we might start with something very simple like feeling the breath, feeling the body, and then the mind gets lost in a train of thought, a train of association. We don't know when we've hopped on the train. We don't know where the train is going. Sometime later, and it could be a couple of moments, it could be minutes, it could be longer. Sometimes people are lost in their trains of thought for many minutes at a time. But at a certain point, we hop off the train. We awaken to the fact that we've been lost in a thought. Right in that moment of waking up from being lost, is a very significant moment and shouldn't be overlooked in meditation. Because right there, in that moment, in looking back, we can understand the power of delusion. We were in a thought, we didn't know that we were thinking, we were caught up in whatever emotions were involved with it. That's the deluded state, not knowing what's present. And yet in that very moment of awakening, that moment of transition from coming out from being lost to the awareness that we've been thinking, right there we connect with wisdom. Right there we connect with the potential of being awake. So that moment of transition is a very interesting one to observe in oneself. And of course, in meditation practice, we can observe this countless times. Generally, especially in the beginning, but even for experienced meditators, the tendency when we realize that we've been lost in a thought is to judge ourselves or to think that thinking is bad. I've lost it again. Actually, a much more skillful approach to becoming aware that we've been lost is in that very moment to delight in the fact that we're now awake. And so every time we come out from being lost in a thought, it's that sense of, this is what wakefulness is. This is what awareness is. And we can take a joy in that and a delight in that. So it really changes the tone of our meditation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. Now, there's one more thing I would like to talk with you about, Joseph, before we move into doing a guided mindfulness meditation practice together, which is in a previous interview that you and I had together. I was talking to you about how mindfulness is often referred to in our culture, mindfulness practice, in very conventional ways, like, I'm mindful of this, that, or the other thing. I'm mindful of this kind of pain or this kind of emotional state. Or, I'm a lot more mindful when I'm getting ready to interrupt somebody in a meeting instead of just interrupting them the way that I used to. I pause and I wait. And we were talking about how this is very helpful and very important. But what you offered, if I understood you correctly, is that in the deepest understanding of mindfulness, there's no identification with an I, me, or mine, with the meditator, if you will, who's being mindful, or the knower who's knowing what's going on. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, about maybe the conventional way that people enter mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness, and some of this, more deep-end understanding of mindfulness.
Well, I think what you're talking about really is, as you say, the beginning stages of mindfulness, when we're really noticing, and sometimes as a meditation technique, even noting internally, mentally, hearing or seeing or thinking or, feeling some sensation. And so we're noticing what's going on. As the practice proceeds, the interesting question then becomes, what do we learn from being mindful? And so mindfulness itself is not the end. Mindfulness actually is a methodology in the service of wisdom. So when we ask the question, well, what do we learn from being mindful? We see over time, as through practice, that whatever arises in our experience is also changing, is passing. And the Buddha said this very often in the text: whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. This seems so obvious to us that we've really stopped paying attention to it. If you go up to anybody in the street and say, do things change? Everybody will say yes. But we don't live that understanding. And so in the meditation practice and through the practice of what you described as the initial stages of mindfulness, that is simply noticing, what is arising, through that observation, we begin to see, yes, it's arising and passing, arising and passing. And we get a very increasingly refined perception of change. So this is of critical importance in the purification of our minds, because the more clearly we experience, or the more clearly we're actually perceiving change in the moment as it's happening, that's what deconditions the tendency of the mind to cling, to grasp. And this, of course, is the essence of freeing the mind. Through this increased awareness of change, and the perception get very, very refined at times as the meditation, goes deeper and the concentration gets stronger, we're seeing arising and passing very, very rapidly. Thoughts and feelings and sensations, and even within one breath, there are hundreds of different sensations going on. As the mind settles into that flow of change, of awareness, it becomes increasingly clear that nothing lasts long enough to be called self, to be called I. And it's through the insight into impermanence that we begin to get, you could say, some glimpses or some intuition of the experience of selflessness. That our whole mind-body process is a process of change, is a process of flow. And of course, we can use the words I or you or self conventionally. It's not that we stop using that language, but we understand that there's no unchanging element in our experience that those words refer to. If we want to use the word self in any way, it really refers to the river, the flow of changes. And it's through seeing that the mind, in a very profound way, begins to let go. It's no longer holding on, at least as much as it did. And so this is the trajectory of our practice. And at a certain point, we could say the most subtle place of identification is with awareness itself.
Yeah.
And so this when we enter this arena, this really starts to happen. As our practice gains some stability, we see that awareness itself is not self, and there are different ways to actually experience this. One technique which I developed, this is not exactly found in the text, but in my own practice, I found it really helpful. I started reframing my experience in the passive voice. So, for example, usually just in our conventional way of living, we think of things in the active voice. I'm seeing, I'm going here, I'm thinking, there's a subject and a verb and an object. When we reframe it in the passive voice, for example, sounds being known, or a thought being known, or a sensation being known, just that simple change of grammar, changing the way we internalize our experience, something very interesting happens. Sound being known, in that framework, there's no subject. And so it's just moment after moment, another object is arising, being known. And I found this particularly useful or accessible in the walking meditation. Just walking and sensations being known. It was quite amazing. It settled the mind in a very simple way into the selfless nature of awareness. That things are being known, and the knowing is not I, it's not mine. Things are being known spontaneously, and intuitively and exactly. So we begin to explore the impersonal, selfless nature of awareness itself.
I like that. That's a very helpful use of language. Thank you.
It really helped transform my practice. This is, it would be something. It would really be something for people to experiment with for themselves. I found it a very effective tool.
Now, Joseph, you're going to lead our participants here in the Meditation Summit in a guided mindfulness meditation practice. And I wonder if you can share just a little bit the context, the tradition from which this practice comes from.
Well, the practice itself comes from that discourse of the Buddha that I mentioned earlier, the Satipatthana discourse, the discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness. And I'm going to be leading a meditation which really touches on all four of these foundations, or you could call arenas of investigation. So it becomes a way of observing, of being with experiences in our body, in our minds. And I think people will get a sense of the comprehensive nature of these instructions. It's really a way of opening up the entire experience of our mind and body and being able to illuminate it all through the power of mindfulness, through the power of awareness. And in that awareness, we begin to see all those things we've been talking about, to see what it is actually that's arising, to begin to experience its changing nature, to begin to perhaps intuit the selflessness of it all. It's just an ongoing process unfolding.
Wonderful. Let's do it.
Okay. So if everyone listening can just sit in a comfortable posture, but not too comfortable. To sit erect, with the back straight, whether it's sitting on a cushion on the floor or on a chair. To sit so there's a sense of dignity, there's a sense of alertness in our posture. The hands can be in any comfortable position, resting on one's knees, or folded in one's lap. And in this particular tradition, we usually sit with the eyes gently closed, although for people who may be practicing more usually with the eyes open, that's also fine to do. So we'll begin by taking just a few deep breaths as a way of settling into the body, of feeling the body, of relaxing. So actually breathe deeply 2 or 3 times. And gently let the breath find its own natural rhythm. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. Relaxing the eyes, relaxing the shoulders, relaxing the heart, the belly. Simply letting the breath find its own natural rhythm. This is not a breathing exercise, it's an exercise in awareness. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. With each breath, you might also notice whether it's a short breath or a long breath, not altering it in any way, simply to begin to notice it with a little more clarity. Sometimes a breath is short, sometimes it's long. Simply to notice that. As you're sitting, feeling each breath, you might become aware of different sensations in the body. The mind may be called to a particular place in the body where there's a strong sensation. If a sensation becomes predominant and calls your attention, that becomes the new object of awareness. At that time we leave the breath and open to whatever that sensation may be. Tightness, or tension, or tingling, or vibration, or warmth, or heaviness, or lightness. If a sensation is calling the attention, open to that sensation. Feel its nature. And begin to notice what happens to the sensation as you're aware of it. Does it get stronger? Does it get weaker? Does it stay the same? Does it seem to shift position? When the sensation is no longer predominant, you can again return to the breathing. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. Whenever the mind is called to a sensation, open fully to the awareness of that. Notice what kind of sensation it is, what happens to it. And you can also notice whether you feel it as being pleasant or unpleasant. This awareness itself is an important part of the meditation practice. If there's some discomfort in the body and you open to that discomfort, tightness, heaviness, pressure, you might make a soft mental note of that sensation. Tightness, tightness, heaviness. And if you feel it as being unpleasant, you might make a soft mental note, unpleasant, unpleasant. Mindfulness means being able to experience these sensations without aversion, without pushing away. Simply to feel it as it is, to see its changing nature. When it's no longer predominant, to return to the breath. There are times when you might feel pleasant sensation, feelings of lightness, of tingling, softness. These too can be the object of our awareness, of our mindfulness. Open to the sensation, feeling it, perhaps noting it as pleasant, pleasant. We're practicing being mindful of the pleasant experiences without clinging, without attachment, without wanting. Simply being mindful of it as it is, seeing its changing nature. As you're being aware of the breath, breathing in, know you're breathing in, breathing out, know you're breathing out. As you're aware of different sensations in the body as they become predominant, you may find at times that the mind gets lost in a thought or an image. As soon as you become aware that you're thinking, or seeing in terms of an image, in that moment of recognition, you can make a soft mental note of thinking, or seeing. This is simply a way of strengthening the observing power of the mind with respect to thought. Sometimes we're not aware of thought till after it's over, and then we remember we've been thinking. Sometimes we become aware in the middle. And sometimes when the mind is clear, we see just when a thought arises. Thinking is not a problem at all. What we want to do is to practice being mindful of thought. And in that moment of waking up from being lost in a thought, recognize the quality of awareness, the quality of wakefulness in that moment. and the difference in our experience between when we're lost in a thought and when we're aware that we're thinking. One of the most interesting aspects of the meditation is to sometimes ask the question, what is a thought? So many thoughts arise in the course of a day, in the course of our meditation practice. And usually we're caught up in the content of the thought and what the thought is saying. And it's good to recognize that content. But on another level, to actually look into the nature of thought itself as a phenomenon. What is a thought? And when we do that, we can see very clearly that the thought is so ephemeral, so insubstantial, so empty. And yet when we're lost in the thought, they have so much power in the mind. When we're aware that we're thinking, they lose all that power. They no longer compel us. So being mindful of thinking is a tremendously freeing aspect of the practice. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. Be aware of any sensations that are predominant, that call your attention. Open to them, feel them. Notice whether you experience them as being pleasant or unpleasant. Notice their changing nature. Whenever you become aware of a thought or image, make a simple note of thinking or seeing. Recognizing that quality of wakefulness when you become aware of them. Lastly, open to or be aware of whatever mind state or mood or emotion is in the mind. Is the mind bored or restless? They can become the object of meditation. Oh, boredom feels like this. Restlessness feels like this. Is the mind interested? Is it wakeful? Oh, interest is like this, wakefulness is like this. Perhaps you're remembering something and you feel very happy. The happiness can become the object of awareness. We open to it, feel it, experience its nature. Notice how that too changes. Happiness feels like this. Delight feels like this. In this way, our practice is to open to whatever is predominant in the moment. Opening to the full range of our experience, in the body, in the mind, in the heart. And with greater and greater clarity and depth, seeing that whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. And the increased refinement of the perception of change, the mind no longer clings as much. We let go. We settle into the flow of experience, the flow of our unfolding process. And it's the mind free of clinging, free of grasping, that leads us on to awakening. When you're ready, you can gently open your eyes if they've been closed and reconnect with the world around you, with what you see, what you hear. This was the crash course in mindfulness meditation.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for bringing mostly yourself to the meditation summit. As someone who's been teaching meditation now for 4+ decades, I do have one final question for you. The purpose of the summit here is to help people deepen and expand their practice. And I'm wondering, in your experience, both as a practitioner and also working with students, what you think the major reasons are that people get stuck, or what's going on when people get stuck in their practice, and what's needed at that point?
Well, I think the basic reason people get stuck is starting to judge the practice and judge themselves in the face of difficulties. This path of practice is not an uninterrupted upward swing to awakening. Mm-hmm. There are many, many ups and downs in the course of practice, times when it's easy, times when it's difficult, times when we're experiencing a lot of pleasure, sometimes when we're experiencing a lot of discomfort. So the course of practice actually is more like a sine curve. It goes up and down, but the slope of the curve is going up. So in any one sitting, we may be more or less mindful, more or less concentrated. The tendency is when we feel restless or we feel bored, we start judging ourselves. Oh, I can't do this. It's too hard. I'm not a good meditator. And so unless there's an understanding that this is a natural part of the practice, people can get discouraged and give up. And so it's really helpful to know that it's all part of the path, that it includes times of difficulty and times of great joy. And what's really needed is just simple perseverance. We just begin again every time we get thrown, every time we get caught up, in some difficulty. Okay, can I come back to the body, just to sit and know we're sitting, to just come back to the simplicity of feeling the breath. And so, in some way our practice is just over and over again, beginning again. We just begin again and begin again and begin again. And over time, we learn to ride the waves of these ups and downs with much greater ease and equipoise. And at that time, the practice, even when it's difficult, there's a certain easefulness to it because we understand. We understand that it's all part of our experience, that everything is to be explored.
Joseph, thank you so much for being part of the Meditation Summit. Thank you.
You're very welcome.